you all for taking the time, and thank you, Zoe and Gabrielle, for organizing this event. I'm excited about it. Hopefully, I'll be able to make some fruitful contribution to the event. So, just as a quick introduction, I am Poulomi Dasgupta. I'm originally from India, and I actually did my PhD on employment generation in India. And I did some village level surveys to study the impact of it, and I will be presenting a bit of that in today's presentation as well. I'm currently in Switzerland, and I am also a research scholar at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. And just a quick note, I tend to speak very fast. So in case I am very fast, please feel free to unmute yourself and just let me know that I'm going too fast. So today's presentation that I am going to make is on employment generation and the care economy, and the case of India's NREGA, which essentially stands for the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. And what I'm hoping to do with this presentation is to show the implications of this program on the care economy, on the aspect and on some aspects of social reproduction. So let's first start with NREGA, right? And for those of you who've heard about it, you might have also heard it being called as NREGA, which is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. But just for simplicity, I will keep referring to this as the NREGA for the rest of the presentation. Just to start off, the United Nations actually recognizes the right of employment as a fundamental human right, right? And this was declared in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And according to the Article 23 of this declaration, everyone has a right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. So given this broader context of employment as a right, NREGA actually fulfills a lot of these requirements in terms of employment as a right. So the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act was introduced in the year 2005. And initially, it started in 200 districts in India. And as of 2023, the scheme covers about 714 districts, and India has about 730 districts. So it pretty much covers almost all of India. And the basic aim of the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act is that it aims at enhancing the livelihood security of people in rural areas by guaranteeing 100 days of wage employment in a financial year to a rural household whose adult members volunteer to do unskilled manual labor. Now, there are a few important aspects to this particular sentence. The first is, of course, the fact that it is aimed at enhancing the livelihood of rural people, right? In other words, it will act as an activity that will provide some kind of supplementary income to people in rural areas. Another important aspect of this sentence is that it guarantees 100 days of wage employment. Now, why 100 days? So as we all know that in rural areas, the main source of livelihood is agriculture. And because agriculture requires cyclical labor, right? So they need, or rather the agriculture requires labor during harvesting season, sowing season, or, at specific times. So essentially what happens is that during the lean season, there's no employment for rural workers, right? And that's about, let's say, 100, 2 to 3 months, and which is what 100 days is, right? About a little bit more than 3 months, right? So it is aimed at creating employment during lean periods in agriculture. And the third important aspect of this sentence is that it is offered to adult members of rural household to do unskilled manual labor, right? And that is extremely important, because what it does is that it targets the poorest of the poor who have no other skills, right? So in other words, it's targeting the most marginalized people, including women, including scheduled caste and backward caste, who may not have any skill sets, right? So a skill set is not a requirement to be a part of this program. So some of the main characteristics of NREGA are as follows. Like I mentioned, that the scheme guarantees up to 100 days of unskilled manual work to one adult from rural household. The state governments can fix the minimum wage under the Minimum Wages Act of 1948 for agricultural laborers as the applicable wage. So there is a set minimum wage which the program has to follow. As a result of it, of course, what we do observe is that the minimum wages, because minimum wages are different in different states, the NREGA wages also fluctuate along with that. Another important aspect is that employment has to be given within 15 days of application for work, because it is a right. Essentially, it is framed under a rights approach, a basic human rights approach. Anybody who is applying for a job have to be given job in 15 days. And in fact, if they're not provided with employment, the state government is responsible for unemployment allowance. 1/3 of the jobs have to be given to women, or 33% is reserved for women. A 60-40 wage to material ratio has to be maintained, which effectively means that of the total expenditure for any given project, 60% has to be for labor, right? So it has to be direct wages to labor, and 40% will go for material, etc., right? And the obvious reason for that is that we don't want an employment guarantee scheme spending more money on material or machines and not providing enough employment, right? It is also to make sure that contractors who are given these contracts do not spend too much money on labor saving technology and guarantee employment to the workers in the villages. And since the program provides jobs at the minimum wage or at the minimum rate, the program has an element of what one would call self-targeting, targeting, right? In other words, adults in rural areas who can get jobs at a higher wage rate in the so-called private sector will not have an incentive to join this program, right? So it's very targeted to the poorest of the poor. So these are some of the aspects of NREGA. And in fact, Jean Dresse, who was an economist who was instrumental in the conceptualization and writing of the first draft of this act, essentially believed that the act would give opportunities to enhance the livelihoods of the rural population. In particular, he argued that this act would help to break the dictatorship of private employer. And this act, or this scheme, of course, was implemented because there was widespread unemployment or underemployment in different parts of rural India. So just to give a sense of the organization of the NREGA, now that I see the fonts may be a bit small, but I'll go over it quickly. The NREGA is actually a bottom-up approach to development, right? So the organization of NREGA actually starts at the village level, and then it sort of moves all the way up to the central government or the center. At village level, the program is guided, or is, it takes place under the guidance of what's called the Gram Sabha, which is sort of the governing body at a village level. And most importantly, it is the Gram Sabha, or the governing body of the villages. Basically, they are the ones who decide the projects in terms of what kind of projects must be undertaken under NREGA. And because a lot of Gram Sabha does have a decent representation of women, women also get some opportunity to discuss and decide what kind of projects must be undertaken by that particular village. They also have the right to carry out social audits, right? So one aspect of NREGA is also the audit and the monitoring of the program, right? It's not just about, carrying out or providing employment, but also to make sure that there is transparency and there's some degree of monitoring and social audit in the process itself, right? So villages and Gram Sabhas can also engage or can ask for social audits. They also, as you can see, they also have a set of obligations. That is, they have to make sure that the projects that have been decided by the Gram Sabha is forwarded to the next level of governance, which in this case is the village cluster or Gram Panchayat. And they essentially consolidate all the recommendations from the different villages, and they basically make a plan for that particular village cluster. Then it goes to the block level, which is basically an organization of village clusters. And the institution that kind of takes care of it is the program officer's office or program office. And they consolidate the Gram Panchayat plans into a block plan, and they basically have the right to receive money for these plans. And as you can see, that they also have a set of obligations, and they receive work applications, allot work, they dispose grievances, etc. Then, of course, you have the district level, which is made up of the different blocks. And then, of course, the state. And we see that the Department of Rural Development is responsible for the operation of NREGA. And they make schemes under the law, they monitor, evaluate, and most importantly, in terms of obligations, they fund 25% of material costs of the projects undertaken. And then, of course, you have the central government or the center, and NREGA falls under Ministry of Rural Development. And they have the right to amend laws. They have the right to collect statistics. In fact, for the longest time, the NREGA website actually did a very good job of collecting data on work days created. It did a really good job of how much funds were being spent, etc. And then, of course, they have the obligation of funding 100% of cost of wages and only 75% of material, because as we know, 25% is taken care of by the state. And they also have the responsibility or obligation to release the central funds on time, etc. So this is sort of the basic organization of NREGA. And as you can see, that it does have a very strong bottom-up approach to development. Now, what exactly does NREGA do? Of course, it provides jobs, but jobs doing what? So the main focus of NREGA is to create asset for the rural parts of the country, right? Now, these assets, as you can see on the slide, have been categorized into different categories, category A, B, C, and D. And so basically, based on the demand for which particular asset is required by a village, different projects are undertaken, right? So as you can see, that category A will essentially relate to natural resource management and mostly water conservation, watershed management, etc. Then you have category B, which allows for community or individual assets for the most vulnerable households, right? So it's not for community at large, but for households that are most vulnerable. So that could include perhaps a well for a particular family. And do remember that these are for the most vulnerable households. So this could also be women-led households as well. And then, of course, you have category C's, which includes jobs or assets that would promote agricultural productivity, and that includes biofertilizers, warehouses for post-harvest storage, etc. And there is also a focus on sort of combining the work created under NREGA with self-help groups, which is usually a small group of women who undertake certain projects in a village. So there's also some degree of integration between NREGA and the work that is done by the self-help group in different villages. And then, of course, there's category D, which provides for rural infrastructure like all-weather roads, sanitation, school toilets, Anganwadi, which is basically sort of a creche system for older children, play fields, building walls for compound walls for government schools, for example, construction of Gram Panchayat buildings, etc. So these are the different kinds of assets that are created under, or can be maybe created under NREGA. Now, because I was sort of more interested in the impact of NREGA on women and the impact of NREGA on the care economy, I decided to focus a bit more on women. So the provisions under NREGA for women, I already mentioned the first one, which is 33% reservation for women under NREGA. That is 33% of the jobs have to go to women. There's provision of creche services and drinking water on site. So it's a mandate that if any work site has more than 5 kids younger than the age of 6, then they have to provide a creche service. And most importantly, equal wages for women. I mean, it seems pretty simple, but it's a pretty drastic, it's a pretty radical approach in terms of mandating equal wages for women in rural areas, which is typically never the case. In addition to these provisions under the Act, the operational guidelines of NREGA provides quite a few other requirements for women. So, for example, widowed women, deserted women, destitute women are considered highly vulnerable, and under NREGA they require special attention. So the Gram Panchayat therefore should identify such women and ensure that they are provided 100 days of work. Pregnant women, lactating women should be treated as a special category as well. And special works basically which require less effort are close and which basically require less effort and are close to their house should be identified for them and implemented for them. Like I mentioned that in case the number of women below the age of 6 years accompanying women on the work sites, a creche service will have to be provided. And in fact, one of the woman worker will basically be made responsible for the care of these children, and she will be paid wages that are equal to the prevalent wage rate, prevalent wage rate that is being paid to the unskilled worker. So the people who take care of the creche also therefore become part of the NREGA program. The guidelines also mandate that preferences should be given to women or workers who are differently abled to work as mates to manage worksite facilities. In other words, the people who are basically managing the worksite facility, like taking attendance, making things are in order, they should have a mate, somebody who's helping them, and the person who's helping them, a higher preference should be given to women or workers who are differently abled. Single women and older person should be given preference to work on work sites near their residences. And this is a pretty significant aspect of the program because it recognizes single women households, right? So that's another progressive aspect of the program. Now, here we can see the participation of women in NREGA. And as you can see that this was, of course, only for the last 4 years or so. There has been a steady participation of about 54.59%. So definitely more than 50%. And these are the women person days generated, right? That is the total number of work days that has been generated for women. That also you can see has increased, and then there has been a slight decline. Now, as I mentioned that the participation is well above the stipulated 33%. However, we have to be careful because the numbers actually vary quite drastically when one looks at state data, right? So some states do really well, and then some states do rather poorly. And part of the reason why women's participation may have seen such high numbers could be a few, right? So one of the one of the things that have happened recently was that there was a mandate which required individual workers to have their own bank accounts for NREGA payments, right? So the idea of payments within the NREGA program is that it will be deposited directly to the bank accounts of the workers who are working. But typically what would happen is that these bank accounts were either held by the male of the households, or there were joint accounts which which again gave more control to the men. But since I think back in 2015 or 2016, a mandate was passed that it has to be individual bank accounts. That is, the worker who's working, the bank account should be in their name. So therefore, women would have their own bank accounts, and that could include, and that would allow them to have control on their bank account. So that could be a reason why we do see such strong numbers. In states like Jharkhand, which is in the eastern part of India and also one of the poorest, actually, the government has stipulated that individual assets have to be registered in women's names, right? So these could be some of the reasons. These could be some of the reasons why we see that that women's participation in NREGA is not, is encouraging. Now, given all this sort of background of NREGA and the provisions for women, I was interested in asking the question that what's the role of NREGA in care economy, and social reproduction? So we know that women do most of the unpaid housework and care work, and there's a lot of literature on that. Even when even when women work for family businesses, they're often unpaid. And women play a crucial role in the social reproduction of our societies. And how do I understand or how do I talk about social reproduction? The feminist concept of social reproduction broadens the definition to include work of maintaining existing life and reproducing the next generation, right? And recent time use survey data from India, in fact, found that women spend far more time on unpaid domestic and care work than men, about 8 times as much, right? So we can safely conclude that women do undertake most of the social reproduction in our societies, as also in rural societies. Now, according to Haven and Kabash, there's a wholesale global crisis of social reproduction, where social life is made to pay the cost of the reproduction of a renegade capitalist system, even as those lives are increasingly unable to reproduce themselves, right? Which are, in most cases, women. So I was curious to see, how does NREGA engage with the aspects of social reproduction, right? So does NREGA help with social reproduction? Now, some aspects of NREGA are in fact considered to be path-breaking in terms of empowering women. So mandating creche on work sites is one such example. And of course, there are many studies that have been conducted to see how NREGA has helped empower women, right? So we see that there is many studies that indicate that women's wages have been positively impacted under NREGA, and there are quite a few studies. So, for example, Ghosh 2014 highlights the role played by NREGA in increasing women's wages. And also there is Dasgupta and Sudarshan, who argue that NREGA has had a positive impact on women's wages in rural economy. They also have shown that participation in NREGA allows for women to have more control over their own incomes as well. Now, CAR 2009 points out that there are 3 dimensions that might be impacted by NREGA. So that's the effect on income consumption. That is, a rise in income of women workers increase the ability to choose the consumption basket that they eventually consume. Intra-household effects, which basically allows women to access paid work, thus widening the scope of their decision-making at home as well. And community effects, which includes women's participation in local governance and processes has increased since NREGA, right? In fact, many economists, many feminist scholars have argued that paid employment is empowering and strengthen women's bargaining position in the household. So in terms of empowering women, NREGA seems to have had a positive impact. NREGA also seems to have some impact on family welfare. So a study by Menati in 2014 in the state of Orissa found that women have benefited individually through access of income, and as a result of it, they have also been able to meet the needs of their family much more efficiently. NREGA has also allowed for better educational enrollments via better wages for women, for example. We have to be a bit careful here because the results are mixed in terms of the impact of NREGA on school enrollment. So, for example, Dave 2011 suggests that there is a positive relationship between NREGA and children's educational outcomes. On the other hand, Das and Singh report that there is a very weak link between NREGA and educational enrollment. So the results are a bit mixed. Of course, a study by Barcia, Di Matos, and Dasgupta show that there is more likelihood of the oldest girls' time spent in schools in NREGA household when compared to non-NREGA households. Again, the link is a bit weak, but there is a slight positive correlation between these two variables. So what we do observe is that NREGA is having some positive impact on various aspects of social reproduction. Now, what I thought I would do at this point is talk a little bit about my own research, which is a bit old. I will be very honest about it, and to determine the different ways in which NREGA has had impact on social reproduction. So I conducted 4 short-term field surveys in the two states in India, Haryana and West Bengal. So you can see that on the map. So one is in the northern part of the country and one is in the eastern part of the country. And these are some of the major works that have been were undertaken in the villages. So you had unpaved roads and water catchment areas. So the first photograph is of unpaved roads, and then the second one is of a water catchment area with water in it, and the third one is a water catchment area which was still under construction when I went there. So these are some of the findings. So the first village was located in Haryana. About 20 people were interviewed, and as you can see, that only 52 work days were guaranteed. So even though it's 100 work days, only 52 were provided. And the main projects that were undertaken were unpaved road and rainwater catchment areas for water conservation. And then you have the second village. Again, about 25 people were interviewed. You can see that the number of work days that they were able to find were much lower at 25 to 30 days only. And again, the main projects that were undertaken were roads and the creation of catchment areas for rainwater. And also there was a long road that was built to connect 2 schools. Then in the third village, again, we see that the primary asset that were created was land leveling for agricultural purposes, as well as social forestry. And then the fourth village in West Bengal actually had very poor asset creation, and they basically had created 2 catchment areas for some rainwater. And when I had visited them, there was no water in it because they had created the catchment area after the monsoon, so there was no water on them. Now, in terms of impact on income, this is sort of the summary findings. And you can see that the impact of income was not significant in 2 villages, and was 3 villages, and there was some impact on 3rd village. We also see that it did help village 2 and 3 in terms of less migration, so people didn't have to go to cities to find work. And these were the different assets that were created under NREGA. So how does asset creation help with social reproduction? So when I spoke to people there, one of the key things that they mentioned is the ability to access school and healthcare, right? So the roads that were built allowed them to access healthcare. So prior to those roads, these villages did not have access to any healthcare. So if somebody got sick, it was really difficult for them to bring them to a healthcare center. But now, ambulances, etc., could actually reach the villages. Kids could go to schools. School children could now go to school even during monsoons when there's too much flooding, and sometimes it's impossible for them to go to school. Another important aspect that I noticed was the ability to access local markets to sell their products. So this, in addition to the income that is being generated by NREGA, this was another supplementary income that could help them, increase their consumption basket. Ability to irrigate their farms, thereby increasing agricultural productivity. And from women's perspective, they were able to access water for household chores. I spoke to multiple women, and many of them were not necessarily participants of the NREGA program. They were just villagers who lived in that village. They said that how these water catchment areas allowed them to access water directly and not having to walk for kilometers to bring water for household chores, and which then allowed them to spend more time with their own children. Some even reported that the older children who would be taking care of the younger children when their mothers went off to get water for their household were now able to go to schools because their mothers didn't have to spend as much time collecting water. So in that sense, these assets do help with social reproduction with respect to giving access to some of the fundamental facilities like school, healthcare, etc. In terms of even environmental reproduction, I did notice that one particular village which spent their NREGA funds to create forests, sort of afforestation, allowed for more water to be held by in the water tables under the ground, etc. So some asset does help in the process of social reproduction. Now, having said that, it's not all rosy, right? There are multiple problems that we see with the implementation of NREGA. These include the most important and the most problematic is wages are not paid on time, right? Which kind of beats the entire purpose of employment guarantee, right? And that's a recurrent theme which I have seen in secondary data, as well as my own interactions with with people in the villages, and it's consistent. Even though my study is a little old now, but even today, when I look up the problem of wages, the main problem is wages are not paid on time. So there's a serious implementation problem. A large number of incomplete works, right? So what happens is because it's a demand-driven program, right? What happens is that every year villages have to come up with something to show that we need this, right? But how many water catchment areas can you have? How many, roads can you have? So a lot of these works are started but not completed because there's no true demand for it. As usual, there are high levels of corruption. The contractors who get the contract for carrying out these projects oftentimes, pay bribes to the local authorities to get these contracts. So that's another huge issue. poor material used in construction of roads and other infrastructure. So basically, you have to sort of keep doing it over and over again, which is a waste of resources and people's time as well. So every time, so if you have unpaved roads, for example, and if it rains, then the next season you cannot use it because it's an unpaved road. On the other hand, because you have to maintain a 60-40 ratio, you can't spend too much money on the material to make better roads. So there's a bit of a conundrum there. Unfortunately, while on the paper, the availability of creches is mandated, that is not true. Creches are not available on work sites. Second, from my research on secondary data, I've also seen that women with children are often discouraged to come to work sites. Instead of being encouraged, they're discouraged. They're often paid less because they have children in tow. Children are often just sort of hanging around on the work site, which makes it dangerous for the children because this is a lot of unskilled work. So there's a lot of digging and those kinds of work. So children are just hanging around. And because there are not enough creches, a lot of women therefore don't feel encouraged to join the program as a result of it. So there are definitely many problems with the implementation of the program. So what are my thoughts on it? So of course, the first aspect is that there has to be a greater focus on the current act itself, right? There's some very good parts of the act, and that there has to be a greater focus on implementing them properly. Now, NREGA can be expanded, some argue, to semi-skilled jobs, right? So instead of just having unskilled jobs, semi-skilled jobs like perhaps helping teachers with the schools, or helping doctors with health centers. So those jobs could also become part of NREGA because that would also allow for skill creation over time. Integration with existing program like integrated child development services. So essentially training people to become child, to take care of children, for example, or help, like I said, help teachers with teaching duties, etc. Decentralization of the public distribution system, which is basically the ways in which the government distributes grains to poor household. So NREGA can also be integrated with creating jobs in the public distribution system as well, because one of the problem of public distribution system is that it's very badly maintained. So a lot of grains go waste as a result of it. So one could also integrate the public distribution system with NREGA. And of course, increase the number of employment days from 100, to more than 100. So while we did see that from my survey that the total number of work days are usually much less than 100, perhaps increasing it to more than 100 may sort of increase the average over time. But for that, we have to be careful about the kind of jobs that are being created in terms of the assets that are being created in the long run as well. So these are just some of my thoughts. There are others who have multiple other thoughts. So that I think that's that. I don't know how I did on time, but yeah. So if there are any questions, or I'm going to stop sharing. Okay.
So thanks a lot, Poulomi. That was very interesting. So now we're going to open the floor for a few minutes of questions, just to coordinate between the people here and the people online. We
just have a few because we're running a little.
Yes, we're exactly. We'll just ask you to raise your hand. We'll be monitoring.
There is a question in the chat.
Okay, yeah. And we'll try to balance between the people here and the people online. So we'll try to fit as many as we can.
Stevens. So can you hear me okay? Just give me a wave.
We can hear you.
So Stephen Hale has a question actually. The Modi, he has read that the Modi government doesn't like this program. Is it true, and does this cause problems? I guess this could go for a long time. Yeah.
Yes. So yes, he's not particularly fond of the program. So interestingly, when he came into power in 2014, he and his government basically made the claim that this program is completely useless. But it's very interesting that every time there are elections around the corner, the program automatically becomes important. And not only that, after COVID, so I don't have the exact numbers in front of me right now, but the spending on Narega has been going down significantly as a percentage of the GDP. But since COVID, because of the way in which the lockdowns were handled, actually, Narega did provide employment to a lot of people who left cities and went back to their home villages, and Narega actually did provide a lot of a large number of jobs. So the focus on Narega really depends on which election, where you are in the election cycle, essentially. Having said that, very recently, maybe just a month ago, there has been huge protests by a lot of Narega workers, because they have made a monitoring system which basically makes attendance online. So through a mobile app, basically Narega workers are supposed to sort of give attendance, like to make sure that they're on the work sites, except that a lot of these workers and farmers don't have the ability, they don't have mobiles, or even if they have mobiles, they don't have dependable mobile services. So even when they went to work, they haven't been able to say that we've been at work. So they're demanding that be taken away, because that's detrimental to the people who don't have access to mobile services. So I don't know if that answers the question. So.
Yes, that's very good. Thank you. There is another question in the chat from Jackson, who asks, the points you mentioned for the future, is there any mechanism for those to come about from a bottom-up perspective, or does it require lobbying?
That's an interesting question. So one of the good aspects of Narega has been that there has been a lot of awareness around this bottom-up approach, right? So there has been, so women and marginalized people have been made aware of how they do have a right to demand work, and not just demand work, but to also decide what work they want to do in terms of the projects that they undertake, right? So it is inbuilt in the system, because it has to come from the Gram Panchayat, it has to come from the village levels. Having said that, the society is complicated, right? So there are aspects where we see that people from certain caste may have a greater say, right, in the kind of assets that are created, especially for individual assets, right? While the Act says that the individual assets have to be for the most vulnerable people, it's often not the case, right? But it provides a legal framework. Right now, like any other legal framework, it sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't, but it does provide a legal framework. So yeah, so the results are indeed mixed. In some states, they do really well. In some states, it's just not that great. Yeah.
Do we maybe just have one more question, perhaps from somebody here in the joinery? If none of you can think of anyone, I've got one. Okay. If you could change one thing to improve their scheme, what would it be?
Sorry, could you repeat that one more time?
If you could change one thing to improve the scheme, what would you change?
Okay. I think part of the problem, now that Narega has been around for more than 15 years, is the creation of assets, right? I strongly believe that there has to be, to sort of encourage, to sort of support social reproduction. I think that there have to be service-based creation of jobs as well. Right. So, like I said, schools and medical centers and, for example, teaching people about sustainable ways of farming, etc. Right. Those are typically now done by smaller cooperatives and self-help groups. But I think service-based jobs could allow for both skill creation and a more sustainable way of sort of carrying out agriculture and social reproduction in general.
Thank you so much. That's that's terrific. Yeah, really appreciate you coming online and speaking with us and sharing your research. It's absolutely fantastic. I might hand back to Martina. If you would like to stay on the line and listen for Zoe's part, you're most welcome. But understand that it's a work day for you. It's probably the middle of the day, so if you need to leave, that's fine. We really appreciate your time and expertise. Thank you, Poulomi. Awesome job.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
So thank you, Poulomi. Now, onto our second speaker, we have Dr. Zoe Gordon. So Zoe will be talking about her work and her research on mainly the Australian scheme relating basically the CDEP and the CDP, which I'm sure Zoe will explain much better than I can ever do. But it's basically a regional and rural job guarantee scheme for First Nations people. I'll give the floor to you. Again, same thing. Any questions? We'll have a short question period afterwards, and you can all ask questions there. Okay, Zoe.
Well, thank you. I hope that you can hear me okay. Let me know if there's any problems there. I am just hoping to access the slideshow button, which I can now access. Great. Okay. So yes, you can hear me. I am in business. Okay, well, I am really happy to be having this opportunity to talk about the Community Development Employment Project Scheme, which is referred to as CDEP most commonly, also CDEP, but more commonly CDEP, because it is a fantastic program, fantastic scheme that was an imaginative response to Indigenous employment or Indigenous unemployment, First Nations unemployment, and offered much more than work in the process. And as some of you may be aware, it has been tragically dismantled back in 1996 after the Liberal National Coalition government took office. They gradually dismantled the program, and then the subsequent governments after them finalised the process. So it's a really sad affair. And yeah, I would just say that I'm basing quite a lot of my talk on an article that I published last year called Road to Ruin, the Howard Government, the Concept of Aboriginal Welfare Dependency and the Fall of the CDEP Scheme. So the reference is there in case any of you wanted the details. And another publication that came out last year I would like to highlight before I start is the Case for a Job Guarantee report that was put out by the Sustainable Prosperity Action Group, SPAG. And you might want to refer to it as SPAG Jog, like Spag Bog, in that it's very nutritious and full of protein. It's a great report that Tori Wade, who's here tonight, is a primary author of, and it's the outcome of a workshop that was held here in Adelaide, and the workshop was a participatory workshop, and the participants worked together to flesh out what a policy could look like in Australia. And the position was formed that it would need to be federally funded, not for profit, permanent, not compulsory, nationwide available, carbon negative, so have a positive effect on the environment with the sort of work that would be carried out, and available to all citizens, all permanent residents over 18 years of age. That's a wonderful artwork at the front there. Yes, so before I start, I will just point out I am not Indigenous. I'm speaking about a program that was developed for First Nations people, and just want to state my own position, my own standpoint, and recognise that I defer to the knowledge and experience and perspective of Indigenous people, First Nations people. I'd also like to echo the acknowledgement of Martina, thank you, that I am certainly speaking on Kaurna land, stolen Kaurna land. And thank you, Poulomi, for your wonderful talk. It was really, really interesting hearing the guts of how the program, the NREGA program works, really beautifully delivered, so thank you. I will now, I won't take a minute, I'll take more like 30. Martina, you might need to keep me to that, but I will try to give a sense of what the CDP scheme was like and what it offered and what we've lost, basically. So a little bit of background. It was introduced in 1977, so a little while ago now, about 40 years ago. And it was actually introduced by a centre-right coalition government, which is a coalition of the Liberal Party and the National Party, both centre-right parties, in Australia. And the Prime Minister at the time was Malcolm Fraser, who's on the top right. But it should be acknowledged that there was a lot of groundwork carried out before the coalition took office, carried out by the Labor government, the centre-left Labor government, which was led by Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, fantastic Prime Minister, probably the best we've had, and he did a lot of groundwork, he pushed really hard for unemployment benefits to be rolled out to remote located Indigenous people, which had been legislated for, but there was lots of barriers in the way, and also for equal wages to be made available to Indigenous workers. And that sort of gives you a bit of a sense of what was happening at the time. Unemployment for Indigenous people, particularly in rural areas and remote areas, was very high and rising, partly to do with the legislative change that it was possible to pay, that Indigenous workers needed to be paid equal wages, also the increased role of machinery in agriculture and farming, cattle work, etc. And the CDAP scheme, in a sense, arose partly to do with this concern about what was going to happen with given rising unemployment, and there was an understanding that there was a lot of important work that could be done in Indigenous communities. And HC Nugget Coombs, a long-serving public servant, was a strong advocate for what became the CDAP scheme. I guess an instigator of the scheme. And for the Fraser government, led by Malcolm Fraser, it was a cheaper option than the $40 million package of policy that had been recommended by a report commissioned on the topic. So it was a compromise of sorts, because it effectively was about the same amount as unemployment benefits, which were about to be made more widely available. The coalition government led by Malcolm Fraser lost office in 1983. And the Labor Party was elected, the centre-left Labor Party, led first by Prime Minister Bob Hawke, seen in the white tie, and Paul Keating in the red tie after him. And they remained in power until 1996, which was a good chunk of time. And in this time, CDAP was very much supported, and it was actually extended beyond remote areas to rural and urban areas, and that was in 1987. And it was around this time as well that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission was created, which was made up of democratically elected Indigenous representatives from all the regions across Australia. And ATSIC, which is commonly known as, housed the CDEP scheme. Before that, it was the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, and then when ATSIC was created, it went to ATSIC. And ATSIC was, certainly a strong supporter of it. Now I will go on to how it worked in a bit more detail. What I argue is really great about the setup was that ATSIC gave block grants to CDEP organisations. So they received the whole amount and were able to pay workers with this funding, and the workers who were paid were entitled to at least 15 hours per week part-time work at the minimum wage, so 15 hours per week works out to about the same as unemployment benefits, but if it's only for 15 hours, that was in line with the minimum wage, which I think is really important as well. CDEP organisations were also receiving additional funding as part of this grant, which included administrative and capital costs. And this was basically an extra 30% on top of the wages component. So that was really helpful for CDEP organisations, but it also shows how much of it really could be offset in terms of money that would already be otherwise going, not already, but would otherwise be going to pay people unemployment benefits, around 70%. Also interesting, top-up wages were available in many areas, and the statistics in around 1996 were that around 40% of workers were actually being paid for over 25 hours, and 22% were receiving over 35 hours. So that had a significant impact on the income of workers. And I have here a map of the spread of CDEP organisations across Australia, which is, very pleasing to see just how many CDEP organisations were developed. And there's around 270 there. Really worth emphasising that key feature of CDEP was that these Indigenous community organisations and the participants were able to determine what counted as work, what work they wanted done, what work they considered to be beneficial for the community, for their psychological, physical, social environments, to nurture culture. They were actually able to define what counted as labour, and as well as control work routines and the payment of these payments. So they were able to be flexible and understanding towards their workers if they felt that was appropriate. Yes, so the private sector and even the public sector here weren't in the position to be deciding what counted as valuable work. I've provided a list here of some of the work that has been carried out by these CDEP workers through CDEP organisations. There's a large variety of work, and these are just some of them, but I'll just run through. We have teaching support, so teaching aids, childcare, people working in childcare centres, aged care, Meals on Wheels, healthcare, certainly a lot of health workers employed. People were also employed at women's centres. Bus driving was another activity that was supported. Night patrolling, really important form of work where communities would keep the communities, the workers would keep the community safe through keeping an eye on things, and it also it reduced arrests, given that there was not that requirement that police be having that same role. There was quite a few tourism benches which were supported in various ways. Also, outstations were supported. So outstations, the term outstation in homelands refers to parts of country that Indigenous people are affiliated with, that they return to away from settlements. So it's away from townships. There's been a big homeland outstation movement since the 70s, as there's been more freedom of movement and also with greater access to country and land rights. So the work that was required the livelihoods that outstation existences involved were supported through CDEP income. Also, you've got landscaping, groundskeeping, farming, oyster farming, emu farming, crocodile farming, vegetable farming, native food farming, a wide variety of farming. And shopkeeping, another important one, given that the work that was subsidised through CDEP work, through CDEP workers, because the workers' wages were subsidised, it meant that it kept costs down for the community stores, which in turn was used to keep the cost of food down. So a really direct effect on health and well-being through more affordable food, and obviously it's the better food that's used to be more expensive. Big concern in remote areas. We also have infrastructure maintenance and construction. It's of a whole lot of different types of infrastructure, certainly houses, making mud bricks, repairing houses, electrical, plumbing, variety of work there. And I'd say one of the most exciting parts was that land management and plant and wildlife harvesting were supported and validated. So having distinctly Indigenous ways of looking after country being supported, and that work counted as valuable work. I could speak for a long time on this, but I won't. I'll just mention why it's particularly important that Indigenous communities, First Nations, nation groups have access to programs such as this, given we are in a still colonial setting where colonialism is part of the everyday, the structure, not an event. We have William Jonas's quote here explaining colonial processes have left a range of effects on Indigenous populations that are interrelated and continue to contribute to the current context of Indigenous disadvantage. Specifically in the area of economic participation, obviously the Indigenous livelihoods that were maintaining everyone's health and well-being prior to colonisation, they've been greatly disrupted. And then also the forcible removal of Indigenous people from their land and the violence and subjugation that was part of that process has had a major impact, and the compulsory nature of a lot of work that was carried out from a lot of our history, indentured labour facilitated through stolen generations policies, where children were taken, forcibly removed, stolen from their families and forced into work settings, whether that's on farms or within homes. So we've got until as late as 1970s and 80s in some parts of Australia, on the basis of race and via comprehensive discriminatory legislation nationwide, and it's even more discriminatory implementation. First Nations workers were denied control over their employment, adequate reward for their labour, safe working conditions, and the prospect of advancement. So this is the very recent current history in which CDEP has emerged. It's always interesting looking at examples of what work certain CDEP organisations were funding and promoting. And I've just mentioned some, and I'm just mentioning like a particular program that a particular line of work that each organisation was supporting, but each organisation had a whole list of work that they were supporting. But First off, I'll mention the Bawinanga Aboriginal Corporation, which is located, is still going, but CDEP program's collapsed, obviously, in Maningrida in Arnhem Land, West Arnhem Land, in the Northern Territory, and in conjunction with Dimmerul Aboriginal Corporation in Nhulunbuy, their neighbour, in East Arnhem Land, also in the Northern Territory, they developed the Indigenous Ranger Program, which has spread not only beyond these areas, but this area, but also out of CDEP. So now it is positions have been solidified outside of CDEP. So this work is continuing, fortunately, but this is because of CDEP that these positions were created, thanks to CDEP. So they're distinctively Indigenous land management practices, a huge variety of them: weed control, fire management, the list goes on, nurturing particular species based on Indigenous knowledge. Or we have the Imama Muda CDEP in Derby, far northwest, Western Australia, which came up with the idea of having a horse patrol program where young people and knowledgeable elders would work together, patrolling communities with police aids, and there's a lot of learning going on, passing down of horse knowledge, and how to make stables and that sort of thing. And of course, improving relationships with police and keeping the community safe. Another great project. Or we have the Bardi Aboriginal Corporation nearby in One Arm Point, far northwestern Australia. The Torres fishing and aquaculture enterprise is very successful and also involves sea patrols, keeping involved in border security. And this enterprise was also involved in relocating the species to areas where it had been reefed out. So very important. You have Napranam Aboriginal Council in Weipa, Cape York, where workers assisted in the construction of a cultural centre. And closer to home, Meningie CDEP, South Australia, supported the Camp Coorong Race Relations Centre. Lastly, we have Forster Aboriginal Land Council in Forster, North New South Wales, supported the Dogwabba Artist Collective. Here we have an example of the work produced by Mandy Davis, New Beginnings, and the program started as an art course and developed into an art studio with over 20 artists. And I have a quote here from Diane Smith. She was specifically talking about red fern urban CDEP, but she was also extrapolating more generally. And she says, CDEP employment is not only an economic endeavour, but is part of a social process, which is preeminently Aboriginal. CDEP employment becomes part of the Aboriginal community's social fabric. The strategic importance of the program has as much to do with cultural and social aspects of employment as with its economic and wage outcomes. I could go on all day, but some of the benefits of the scheme that have been noted: increased self-esteem and pride, increased sense of Aboriginality, various positive health impacts, social cohesion improved, social capital improved, teaching and maintenance of culture, another result, and something that's another outcome, and fewer people caught up in the judicial system, sense of ownership of the community and the projects, strengthened relationships between and within families, which has a knock-on motivational effect as well. And also drug use, alcohol use and gambling reduced, and increased sense of autonomy, and really crucially, strengthened governance. And I will just now cut to a small section of a video.
Training is done on the job.
Yeah, I like it here.
Draw up all the budgets.
And now I work pretty much full-time.
To move into mainstream employment.
Without CDP, I wouldn't be employed.
For over 25 years, thousands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been fulfilling their obligations to communities through CDP and foregoing their unemployment benefits. Nationwide, over 35,000 CDEP participants in more than 1,000 communities share in the benefits of CDEP. CDEP was set up to assist in the development of communities and to improve economic, social and cultural outcomes for Indigenous peoples. Whether meeting the needs of communities or individual participants, the scheme's broad contribution to Indigenous communities means it has always been many different things to different people. Developing community infrastructure and delivering municipal services, traditional CDEP projects remain an essential part of many communities. In others, where labour market opportunities exist, training and jobs are a priority, and business development has now become a focus.
See you there. Bye-bye.
The priorities of CDEPs may differ greatly from region to region, but managing the increasing demands on CDEP organisations and improving the capacity to identify needs, plan activities and find the necessary resources are goals that are the same for everyone. South East Queensland CDEP has moved from a position of struggling to maintain participant numbers through a major expansion and now has a waiting list of participants wanting to join their program. It's been done by identifying the needs of the community and then offering participants access to a diverse range of over 100 projects and to training which is in line with their career choices.
Matching jobs to people is probably the most important part, and when people ask the success of the South East Queensland CDP, I believe this is probably the most important part. Try and match the person to the job that they are interested in and that they will stay in.
Community consultation has been vital to the success of the Ocean Rhythm Surf School. It's an example of how South East Queensland CDEP found a way to keep participants focused and on the program when the surf was up.
A few years ago we got involved with the CDP program on the South East Queensland one. We're all surfers, so we surfed a lot more and the surfing got sort of caught up with our mum on the lawn. So with the help of Southern Australian CDP, we started our own surf school, which we're running today. Go surfing! Yeah.
With our work, instead of marking it all up with surfing and at the same time, we just decided to make surfing our work.
Then there's the Cyber Cafe, which is providing training in a range of fields, from hospitality through to information technology.
There are a number of activities which reflect the diversity of the CDEP program. They range from night patrols, education workers, health workers, and the list goes on. We need to demonstrate to government that CDEP is not only an economic development program, but it also assists in community development and community capacity building.
CDEPs will now be able to report on their outcomes in 2 other ATSIC output groups. While economic development currently makes up only 31% of CDEP activities, 24% assist in the promotion of cultural authority and 45% contribute to improving social and physical well-being. By reporting all of these achievements to ATSIC, CDEPs are able to showcase the broad contribution the scheme is making to their communities and participants.
Reporting across all output groups strengthens our programs and recognises the CDEP's contribution to our community needs. While CDEP is funded under our Economic Development Output Group, we still have to highlight and promote to government CDEP's broad contribution to our communities.
ATSIC is supporting CDEPs to develop viable businesses, especially in communities where there are limited employment opportunities. Several years ago, Bangala CDEP at Port Augusta turned its focus to setting up and operating its own businesses as part of a long-term strategy to employ local Indigenous people.
Business development over the last probably 4 years has been a very high priority of Bangala's. Our building operation has been one of our great success stories here. Last year we turned over nearly $1.5 million. Lately, in the last 18 months, developed that on in one of our regional centres, where we now have a very successful transportable building division.
One of Bangala's most successful ventures is a childcare centre. It provides a much-needed service to the Port Augusta community and, importantly, is a significant training ground and, for others, a career choice.
An opportunity came up about 2 years back to take over the management of the childcare centre located at the TAFE College. We identified the fact that we didn't really provide terribly good work programs for women here. Since that time, the childcare centre has become one of our flagship programs and one of our more successful, given that it provides opportunities for us to ready people for mainstream employment by working in the childcare centre and having a good deal of contact with the general public.
With CDEP taking over, Bangala taking over the childcare, it's been very important for me because it has given me a career opportunity. Once I'm finished my training, which isn't long, I'll be able to manage the centre.
But the advantages of getting into business for Bangala are not all about money. The Indigenous community is also winning respect and recognition as an integral part of the local economy. CDEPs across Australia are finding better ways to improve their performance and the service they provide to their participants. Whether the focus is community development, employment and training or business development, they are making long-term plans and identifying the resources required to deliver a service that fits local needs. Whether this is through developing meaningful activities to fit the needs of their participants, new ways of encouraging local employment, the benefits of joining forces with other CDEPs, or increasing their effectiveness through partnerships with key agencies and service providers, the result is a CDEP open to new ideas, responsive to local needs, and able to perform a better job for both their participants and the community.
So I do want to point out that there was significant cultural benefits to CDEP. It was flexible and that allowed participants to practice culture and ceremony or meet cultural obligations outside of work, obligations which sometimes involve travel. Also, customary work of participants was counted as productive labour, including caring work. And crucially, participants could stay and work on country, very culturally important there. Political benefits, which is to do with the control the communities had, they were able to design the work, control the projects, and this really strengthened the organisations, and they were able to take on more of a representative and advocacy role, as well as mediate community members with government and guide them through. And Tim Rouse has commented, I want to promote political development as an essential part of the vocabulary with which we discuss CDEP, so that we can appreciate CDEP as one of the most significant steps ever taken in this country towards Indigenous self-determination. What happened? How could this go wrong? The centre-right coalition Liberal National government was elected, led by Prime Minister John Howard in 1996, and everything went wrong from there. The bipartisan support the project had enjoyed dried up, and Howard's war on self-determination as Indigenous leader Joe Morrison has called it, began. And Aboriginal welfare dependency at this point became presented as a key problem. Basically, Indigenous unemployed people were being described as the cause of their own unemployment, voluntary unemployment in a sense. And CDP was presented as a form of welfare dependency, despite people actively working for funds that they could achieve without working. The new aim of CDEP became to exit participants off the scheme and into the market, jobs that didn't exist. Same around this time, ATSIC was abolished, actually illegally, and this was a step towards dismantling CDEP because ATSIC was a key defender of the CDEP program. And in the final term of their office, the Howard government closed down CDEP organisation, CDEP programs in urban and regional areas, and then as part of the Northern Territory intervention, closed down all CDEPs in the Northern Territory. Massive move. Most CDEPs were located in the Northern Territory. Then a new government was elected, and the government was a Labor government, centre-left Labor government, led by Prime Minister Kevin Rudd and then Julia Gillard, and then Kevin Rudd until 2013. And really, they maintained the same position as the Howard government, or the government led by Prime Minister John Howard. But they did reinstate the remote programs in the Northern Territory, but they closed more remaining non-remote programs, and they restructured the program as well. And then in order to replace CDEP, in order to fully dismantle CDEP, they replaced it with the Remote Jobs and Communities program, RJCP, which was not community controlled, which required 16 to 20 hours more, so required more labour and somewhat flexible activities, and there were all sorts of problems associated with this. But it got even worse when the coalition Liberal National government was re-elected, when the Liberal Party, in coalition with the National Party, gained power in 2013. So just 3 months later, we have Prime Minister Tony Abbott changing the RJCP to the Community Development Program, CDP, which sounds almost exactly like CDEP. And that was on purpose. But to be confusing, but completely different scheme, highly punitive, 25-hour week to begin with, which was a massive jump. You also had to join the program as soon as you're on unemployment benefits, which differed from a workfare program that was existing in non-remote areas, where you had a period of time before you had to join up. And certainly not community controlled, run mostly by for-profit providers, extremely complicated reporting system, very easy to be breached. The rates of penalties skyrocketed, more than the actual amount of participants. So each participant was having one or more penalty, and a lot of people were just leaving unemployment benefits completely. And so the poorest in the country became even poorer, have become even poorer. And there's lots of reports of families going hungry and worsening mental health and family well-being. And the three words keep coming up: dehumanising, disempowering, and demoralising. There has been a few pauses on the program, given how extreme the consequences have been. And during COVID, there was a pause put on activities, full stop. And then last year we had the election of a Labor Party back, so they've gained office again. And we have Prime Minister Anthony Albanese pictured. And the situation at this point is that the activity requirement of CDP remains paused while the Labor Party, the Labor government, explores a redesign of the program. Time will tell whether something like CDEP is reinstated, but I'm not holding my breath. I am crossing my fingers. And I'll just point out, my analysis is that the CDEP scheme was, the reason given for the collapsing of the CDEP scheme was that it was welfare and therefore welfare dependency standing in the way of private sector employment. And here you have neoliberal ideas working with colonial narratives, converging, depicting Indigenous subjects as to blame, responsible for their own poverty and needing to be integrated through various means. What can we learn? There's a lot to be taken from the CDEP model and from the CDEP experience, and I am very confident that there is so much to be taken from what's happened in Australia already, and that it can be used to come up with another version, not just for Indigenous people, but also for non-Indigenous Australians, and obviously particularly important for First Nations people for particular reasons, and the coupling of self-determination project with job creation is crucial. But also this aspect of it being being community controlled is something that all and any job guarantee program would be wise to take on board, because it has been a huge part of the success of the program. Also important that it was voluntary, and what your objectives are of the program matters. They matter, in line with the Sustainable Prosperity Action Group's report, and the initial objectives of CDEP before it was modified by the government led by John Howard. Key objectives which work really well and are really important are caring for country, caring for people, and caring for community. One last quote, this is from a CDEP provider, Indigenous resident, interviewed as part of a government report into the CDP program, which is the new program, highly problematic program. And this person is commenting on how much better CDEP was. And they say, in CDEP, all Aboriginal people had a job. CDEP, bring them together in one as self-determination. It was under Aboriginal organisation. People at that time had authority and power in their own community, working well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zoe. There's two questions in the chat which we might quickly go to, and then perhaps we can open it up for questions from the floor here. We won't go too long because we've been sitting down in these chairs for quite a while, but I will just share with you Rachel's question. So Rachel asks, you mentioned that 30% of the program funds were allocated to admin and capital costs. To what extent was high quality management of the projects built in and emphasised? I mean, I guess that's like, because it's Aboriginal run. So to what extent was that sort of that managerial part of it emphasised in and how did it work with the cultural part?
That's an interesting question. Thank you. I think that the scheme was no longer. Was certainly experimental, and different communities had different experiences, and the quality of the managers had a big impact, and their cultural sensitivities and their knowledge and ability to adapt and be flexible themselves. Often it was non-Indigenous managers. That was probably the norm. But given there was a fair amount of power within the communities and within the participants, I think that helped make it more of a Indigenous or First Nations workspace in terms of the values and way it was run. I think focus on management is a really important area, and there was that's something that does make a big difference. So yeah, I think that's really interesting to bring that up.
Thank you. There's one more question from Anne. She asks, has there been any research looking retrospectively at the impact of ending the CDUP and the sort of targets identified in closing the gap framework, which, as we know, has its own problems?
Sure. Yes, it does. And a key point made is that statistical equality isn't everything, because the right to be different is also important, and you can't necessarily gauge all the aspects of well-being on those statistics. There has been quite a bit of tracing of what's happened, and attention being paid to the impacts and the feelings that have come with these changes. And it's interesting, even government reports, which are not looking for criticism, it still just slaps you in the face. But yeah, if you're interested, the Centre for Aboriginal Economic and Policy Research have forever been watching CDEP program since it was started, but they've also traced and analysed what's happened since, and they've got some excellent publications with multiple authors, so edited volumes. Job creation, there's one that starts with job creation. There's one titled something like Better Than Welfare. Zoe Gordon, John Altman, anything by John Altman is very informative. And he's got a lot to do with the Bawinanga Aboriginal Corporation in Maningrida. He's got connections there. So he's been watching what's happening there. And Elise Klein, who's been looking at more the impact on women. And Zoe Staines, Lisa Folks has been watching it very closely as well. So there's a body of knowledge, a body of work there that I would absolutely invite people to have a look at. And if you go to the ANU website and look up CAEPR, it's there. Good question, thank you.
Thank you. I might just ask the people here at the joinery if anybody would like to come up. Yeah, okay. Yes, come right up.
Thanks. Would you like to speak?
Just speak to the computer there. Yeah.
Hi. I'm speaking on behalf of the neoliberal bean counters. Was there any study done in the cost of welfare compared with the costs of the CDEP when it was in full swing, and compared with the expenses of the poverty industry, like criminal corrections, ill health, alcoholism, and family dysfunction? Do we have any knowledge of how much the CDEP actually cost when you take into account the advantages of the CDEP?
Thanks, Neil.
Yeah.
Excellent question as well. Thank you. So it is really just abundantly clear how very cheap CDEP was. So if keeping costs low is your major imperative. CDEP stands out as a very easy policy to adopt. Like I said, it was about 30% admin and capital costs above how much it would be ordinarily to pay people that much in welfare payments. I think at its height, the cost of CDEP per year was around 500 million. So around 70% of that was was unemployment benefits. It was how much it would have cost to pay these individuals unemployment benefits. So you've only got 30% of that. And obviously you're saving so much more in terms of all the other costs, which are almost impossible to count. And what a sad and morbid project that would be to count. But, certainly, it's really clear how much communities have suffered. It's just really obvious. And these are communities that need, to repair and restore, not be further hit. And I was also going to say how much the CDP, the new policy, how extremely expensive it has been in terms of how much it's cost to pay these private contracted providers, these businesses. Their expenses are huge, and it's just shocking how much more it's cost. There's no question that it's much more expensive to have had the CDP, which is supposed to just punish. I could talk for ages about what's going on there, but I won't. But much more expensive, absolutely, than CDEP.
Thank you so much. I think we might leave it there in terms of questions. But I just wanted to read you a comment from Alison, which is absolutely beautiful and kind of sums up what we've gotten out of this session. Alison writes, "I wanted to thank you both for these interesting presentations, especially as they provide longitudinal examinations of rural employment programs and their tenuous nature. I'm particularly interested in the ways in which each has a more expansive view of what constitutes economic activity and employment, cultural aspects, political aspects, and social reproduction." And yeah, I think that is a great way to sum up the event and to thank both of our wonderful speakers tonight. And yes, round of applause. Brilliant. So I'm going to stop the recording, and we will edit this recording and put it out on our YouTube channel so that other people who've missed it tonight can see it, but without the long bits where we struggle with technology. So thank you for joining us, everyone.